Hey there, and welcome to True Scary Stories. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That helps YouTube know you love creepy stories, and it'll keep sending more your way. 7 True Neighbor Horror Stories. Story 1. The Night Watcher. When Sarah moved into the quiet suburban house on Maple Street, she thought she'd found the perfect place to start over after her divorce. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, with well-maintained lawns and friendly faces, but it didn't take long for her to notice something unsettling about the house directly across from hers. Every night, without fail, a man would stand at his upstairs window and stare at her house. At first Sarah thought it was just coincidence. Maybe he was looking at something else, or perhaps he suffered from insomnia. But as days turned into weeks, she realized the pattern was too consistent to ignore. The man was elderly, probably in his 70s, with wild gray hair and hollow eyes that seemed to bore right through her windows. He would appear at exactly 11:30 p.m. and remain there until dawn. Sarah tried closing her curtains, but somehow she could still feel his presence, watching and waiting. One night, curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed binoculars from her closet and positioned herself at her bedroom window. Through the lenses, she could see him more clearly. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, and his eyes never blinked. But what made her blood run cold was what she saw scattered around his windowsill. Dozens of photographs, all appearing to be of her house, her car, and disturbingly, some that looked like they were taken from inside her home. Sarah immediately called the police, but when they arrived, the man was gone from the window. The officers knocked on his door, but no one answered. They told Sarah there wasn't much they could do. Without proof of actual stalking or trespassing, she would have to document everything and call back if the behavior escalated. That night, Sarah barely slept. She kept checking her locks and peering through her curtains. At 11:30, like clockwork, he was back at his window, but this time, he was holding something up to the glass. Sarah squinted in the darkness and realized it was one of the photographs, a picture of her sleeping in her own bed. Her hands shaking, she called 911 again. While waiting for the police, she noticed movement in her backyard. Using her phone's flashlight, she illuminated the space below her window. Footprints in the soft soil led from her neighbor's yard to right beneath her bedroom window. Fresh footprints, still damp with dew. When the police arrived this time, they took Sarah's report more seriously. They searched the neighbor's property and found an unlocked basement door. Inside, they discovered a makeshift darkroom filled with hundreds of photographs of Sarah and the previous homeowner, a woman who had moved away suddenly just before Sarah bought the house. The man, whose name was Harold Peterson, had been watching women in that house for over 15 years. The walls of his basement were covered with pictures taken through telephoto lenses, some clearly shot from inside the women's homes. The police found evidence that he had been making copies of house keys and entering the property while the occupants were away. But the most disturbing discovery was a journal detailing his obsession. Harold had written detailed entries about each woman's daily routines, their habits, their fears. The entries about the previous owner ended abruptly with a final note. She saw me inside, had to make her leave. Next one will be different. Harold was arrested that night, but during transport to the county jail, he suffered a massive heart attack and died. Sarah thought her nightmare was over, but she was wrong. 3 days after Harold's death, Sarah woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of tapping on her bedroom window. When she looked outside, She saw Harold's figure standing in his usual spot at the window across the street, even though she knew the house was empty. His family had cleaned it out immediately after his death, and it was already on the market. The tapping continued, and Sarah realized it was coming from her own window. When she turned on her bedside lamp, she saw Harold's face pressed against the glass from outside, his dead eyes wide and unblinking. She screamed and called 911, but by the time police arrived, nothing was there. This happened 3 more times over the next week. Each time, Harold's ghost would appear at his old window, then somehow manifest outside her bedroom window, tapping on the glass with bony fingers. The police began to think Sarah was having a breakdown from the trauma of the stalking incident. On the 7th night, after Harold's death, Sarah decided she'd had enough. She packed her belongings and prepared to leave town. As she loaded her car, she looked up one final time at Harold's house. There he was, standing at the window, but this time he wasn't alone. Sarah could see the shadowy figures of other women standing beside him, victims from decades past, all trapped in his obsessive gaze. Sarah drove away that night and never returned to Maple Street. The house remained empty for months, until another single woman bought it. Within a week, neighbors reported seeing someone standing at Harold's window again, watching the new occupant. The cycle had begun anew. The new homeowner, Jessica, lasted exactly 2 months before she too disappeared, suddenly one night, leaving behind all her belongings. Some say if you drive by the house on Maple Street, late at night, you can still see Harold at his window, no longer alone, surrounded by the shadows of those who couldn't escape his eternal watch. Story 2. The basement sounds. Mike and Jenny thought they'd hit the jackpot when they found the duplex on Cedar Avenue. The rent was incredibly cheap for such a nice neighborhood, and their half of the building was spacious and newly renovated. The only downside was their neighbor, an older man named Frank, who lived in the adjacent unit and kept to himself. Frank was polite enough when they occasionally saw him, but he was odd. He had a habit of staring just a little too long during conversations, and he always seemed to be home, no matter what time of day or night. Mike and Jenny could hear him moving around through the thin walls, especially late at night, when heavy footsteps would pace back and forth in what they assumed was his bedroom. The strange sounds started about a month after they moved in. It began with soft thumping noises coming from below their apartment, even though they were told the basement was used only for storage and utilities. The thumps would occur at irregular intervals, sometimes rapid and frantic, other times slow and methodical. "Maybe it's the water heater," Jenny suggested one evening as they lay in bed listening to the sounds, but Mike knew water heaters didn't make thumping noises that seemed to move from one area of the basement to another. As weeks passed, the sounds became more disturbing. Along with the thumping, they began hearing what sounded like muffled voices, not conversation but more like someone trying to shout through a gag. Jenny convinced herself it was Frank, watching television too loudly, but Mike wasn't so sure. One Saturday morning, Mike decided to investigate. He knocked on Frank's door, under the pretense of borrowing a tool. Frank answered quickly, almost as if he'd been waiting right by the door. He was sweating despite the cool morning air, and Mike noticed his hands were dirty, with what looked like fresh soil under his fingernails. "I was just wondering if you had a wrench I could borrow," Mike said, trying to peer past Frank into the apartment. "Don't have one," Frank replied curtly, already beginning to close the door. "Also, I hope you don't mind me asking, but we've been hearing some sounds from the basement at night. Do you know if there's a problem with the plumbing or heating system?" Frank's face went pale, and his grip on the door handle tightened. "Basements off limits to tenants. Landlord's rules. Sounds are probably just the old pipes settling." That night, the sounds were worse than ever. Along with the thumping and muffled voices, Mike and Jenny heard what sounded distinctly like crying, a woman's voice, weak and desperate. Jenny wanted to call the police, but Mike convinced her to wait until morning when they could talk to the landlord first, but they never got the chance. At 3 a.m., Jenny woke Mike up in a panic. "There's someone in our apartment," she whispered. They both lay perfectly still, listening. Heavy footsteps were moving through their living room, slow and deliberate. The floorboards creaked with each step, and they could hear furniture being moved around. Mike grabbed a baseball bat from beside the bed and slowly opened the bedroom door. The living room was empty, but their couch had been moved several feet from its original position, and the area rug was bunched up in the corner. Most disturbing of all, there were muddy footprints leading from their front door to the kitchen, and then simply stopping in the middle of the room. Mike called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of forced entry. The officers suggested that perhaps they had moved the furniture themselves and forgotten, or that the mud had been tracked in earlier, and they hadn't noticed. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but couldn't do much more without evidence of an actual break-in. The next day, Mike decided to do some research on their building. What he found made his blood run cold. Over the past 5 years, 3 different tenants in their unit had moved out suddenly, all citing disturbances and feeling unsafe. One woman had filed a missing person report for her sister, who had been staying with her, but the sister was never found. More disturbing was what Mike discovered about Frank. His real name was Franklin Morse, and he had served 10 years in prison for kidnapping before moving into the duplex. The conviction was for holding a woman in his basement for 6 months before she managed to escape. That evening, Mike and Jenny heard the sounds again, but this time they were different. Along with the usual thumping and crying, they heard what sounded like digging. Jenny called the police, while Mike grabbed a flashlight and headed outside to look for an external entrance to the basement. Behind the building, partially hidden by overgrown bushes, Mike found an old storm cellar door. The padlock was broken, and the door was slightly ajar. From inside, he could hear the sounds much more clearly now. Definitely digging, and definitely someone crying for help. Mike called down into the darkness, "Hello, is someone down there?" The digging stopped immediately. Then a weak female voice called back, "Help me, please, he's going to kill me." Mike ran back to the house just as the police arrived. This time they took the situation seriously. Officers surrounded the building, while others entered the basement through the internal access from Frank's apartment. What they found was a nightmare. Frank had excavated a series of small rooms beneath the building, accessible through the storm cellar. In one room, they found a woman who had been reported missing 3 months earlier. She was chained to a wall, barely alive from dehydration and malnutrition. In another room, they found remains, bone fragments and clothing belonging to at least 2 other victims. Frank had been using the basement as his personal prison and graveyard for years. Frank was arrested trying to flee through his apartment's back door. During his confession, he admitted that he had been entering Mike and Jenny's apartment through a hidden passage he'd carved between the basement and their floor. He had been watching them sleep, moving their belongings, and planning to eventually take Jenny as his next victim. The woman they rescued survived, though she suffered from severe PTSD and had no memory of several weeks of her captivity. Frank was sentenced to life in prison without parole, but the building was condemned and eventually demolished. Mike and Jenny moved across the country after the trial. They still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, listening for sounds from below. Even in their new home, which sits on a concrete slab with no basement, they sometimes hear the phantom sounds of thumping and crying echoing from beneath their feet. Story 3. The perfect garden. Linda had always admired her neighbor's garden. Mrs. Chen, who lived in the house next door, maintained the most beautiful flower beds Linda had ever seen. Roses, tulips, daffodils, and exotic plants that seemed to bloom perfectly regardless of the season. The garden was the envy of the entire neighborhood, and Mrs. Chen often won local gardening competitions. What made it even more impressive was that Mrs. Chen was in her 80s and lived alone since her husband died 5 years earlier. She worked in her garden every day, rain or shine, tending to her plants with the dedication of someone half her age. Linda, who had just moved in next door, introduced herself one morning while Mrs. Chen was working in her prized flower bed. The elderly woman was friendly enough, though she spoke with a heavy accent that made her sometimes difficult to understand. She proudly showed Linda around her garden, explaining her techniques for growing such vibrant flowers. "The secret," Mrs. Chen said with a mysterious smile, "is in the soil. Very special fertilizer, very nutritious." Linda complimented the beautiful plants and asked where Mrs. Chen bought her fertilizer. The old woman's smile faded slightly, and she became evasive. "I make myself, old family recipe from China. Very potent, but very, how you say, specific ingredients." Over the next few weeks, Linda noticed that Mrs. Chen's gardening habits were quite unusual. She would work exclusively at night, often starting around midnight and continuing until dawn. Linda could see her through her bedroom window, digging and planting under the glow of a small flashlight. One night, Linda watched as Mrs. Chen wheeled something heavy in a large tarp from her garage to the garden. Whatever was in the tarp was long and bulky, and Mrs. Chen struggled to drag it to a freshly dug hole near her prize-winning rose bushes. She worked for hours, filling the hole, and then carefully planting new flowers on top. The next morning, Linda noticed that Mrs. Chen's roses were more vibrant than ever, and she had added several new plants to that section of her garden. When Linda complimented the new additions, Mrs. Chen just smiled and said, "New fertilizer working very well." Linda began paying closer attention to her neighbor's activities. She noticed that Mrs. Chen never seemed to have visitors, but occasionally men would come to her house, usually older, single men who looked lonely or down on their luck. Mrs. Chen would invite them in for tea, and Linda would see them talking in the kitchen through the window. But these men never seemed to leave. Linda would see them arrive, but she never saw them depart. When she asked Mrs. Chen about her visitors, the old woman would claim not to understand, or would change the subject. One evening, Linda saw a familiar face at Mrs. Chen's door. It was Bob, a homeless man who often panhandled near the local grocery store. He looked cleaned up and was carrying a small suitcase. Mrs. Chen welcomed him warmly and invited him inside. Over the next 3 days, Linda kept watching for Bob to leave, but she never saw him. On the 4th morning, she noticed Mrs. Chen working in her garden again, this time in broad daylight. She was planting a new section near her vegetable garden, and the plants she was putting in were larger and more robust than any Linda had seen before. Curious and increasingly concerned, Linda decided to do some research. She went to the local library and looked up Mrs. Chen in old newspaper archives. What she found made her stomach turn. 5 years earlier, when Mrs. Chen's husband died, there had been a brief investigation into his death. He had supposedly died of natural causes, but neighbors had reported seeing Mrs. Chen digging in her garden the night before she called to report finding him dead in his bed. The investigation was dropped due to lack of evidence and Mrs. Chen's age and apparent frailty. But more disturbing were the missing person reports Linda found. Over the past 4 years, 6 men had been reported missing in the area. All were older, homeless, or otherwise isolated individuals. All had last been seen near Mrs. Chen's neighborhood. That night, Linda called the police and reported her suspicions. She expected them to dismiss her concerns, but the officer who took her call said they would look into it. Apparently, they had been tracking a pattern of disappearances in the area and had already identified Mrs. Chen as a person of interest. 2 days later, the police arrived with search warrants. Linda watched from her window as they carefully excavated Mrs. Chen's garden. Within hours, they had uncovered human remains buried throughout the property. The bones were in various stages of decomposition, suggesting the murders had been happening for years. Mrs. Chen was arrested without resistance. During questioning, she confessed to killing 12 men over the past 5 years. She had been luring lonely, isolated men to her home with promises of companionship and home-cooked meals. She would poison their tea with rat poison, then bury their bodies in her garden. The most chilling detail of her confession was her motive. Mrs. Chen genuinely believed that human remains made the best fertilizer for her plants. She had been documenting which sections of her garden grew best over which bodies, treating her victims like experimental subjects in a grotesque gardening study. During the investigation, police also exhumed Mrs. Chen's husband. The autopsy revealed high levels of rat poison in his remains. He had been her first victim, killed when he discovered what she had done to a homeless man she had brought home earlier that week. Mrs. Chen showed no remorse during her trial. When asked why she had killed so many people, she simply said, "My garden was most beautiful in neighborhood. Flowers need food to grow strong." The house next door to Linda was demolished after the investigation. The soil was so contaminated with human remains and chemicals that it was considered a biohazard. The lot remains empty to this day. Linda moved away shortly after the trial, but she could never forget the sight of those perfect flowers blooming above their gruesome secret. She still gardens, but she's never been able to grow flowers as beautiful as the ones that grew in Mrs. Chen's yard. Sometimes she wonders if that's because she's missing the key ingredient, and sometimes she's grateful that she'll never know for sure. Mrs. Chen died in prison 2 years into her life sentence. Even in her final days, she kept asking the guards if they had been watering her flowers. She never understood why what she had done was wrong. To her, she had simply found the perfect fertilizer. Story 4. The Midnight Musician. When David moved into the apartment complex on Riverside Drive, he was told by the landlord that the building was quiet and perfect for someone who worked night shifts like he did. David was a security guard at a local factory and needed to sleep during the day, so finding a peaceful place was essential. For the first week, everything seemed perfect. The building was indeed quiet during daylight hours, and David was able to get the rest he needed. But then he met his upstairs neighbor, a man named Vincent, who claimed to be a classical musician. Vincent was thin and pale, with long black hair and an intense stare that made David uncomfortable. He spoke in an oddly formal manner and always wore a black suit, even when just checking his mail. When David mentioned that he worked nights, Vincent's eyes lit up with interest. "How wonderful," Vincent said. "Then you'll be awake to appreciate my practice sessions. I do my best work after midnight." That night, David learned what Vincent meant. At exactly 12:30 a.m., the sound of piano music began filtering down from the apartment above. It wasn't just any piano music. It was complex, haunting classical pieces played with incredible skill. The music was beautiful, but somehow unsettling, filled with minor keys and dissonant notes that seemed to creep under David's skin. The music continued until dawn, stopping abruptly when the sun came up. David didn't mind at first. He was awake anyway, and Vincent was clearly talented. But after several nights, David began to notice something strange about the music. The same pieces played every night, in the exact same order, with the exact same mistakes in the exact same places. It was as if Vincent was playing along to a recording rather than actually performing. But David could hear the physical sounds of the piano keys being pressed, the pedals being used, and occasionally what sounded like Vincent humming along. One night, David decided to investigate. He quietly climbed the stairs to Vincent's apartment and listened at the door. The music was definitely coming from inside, but mixed with the piano, David could hear other sounds, voices, multiple voices, all humming along to the music in perfect harmony. David knocked on the door, planning to ask Vincent about his musical guests. The piano stopped immediately, and after a long pause, Vincent opened the door. He looked disheveled and was breathing heavily, as if he'd been running. "David," Vincent said, blocking the doorway with his body. "What brings you here so late?" "I just wanted to compliment your playing," David said, trying to look past Vincent into the apartment. "I couldn't help but notice you have other musicians with you tonight." Vincent's face went pale. "Other musicians? No, it's just me. Perhaps you're hearing the neighbor's television." But David could still hear the humming coming from inside the apartment, soft but distinct, multiple voices, all harmonizing with a melody that wasn't being played. The next day, David asked other neighbors about Vincent's musical guests. What he learned was disturbing. According to the landlord, Vincent lived alone and had for the past 3 years. No one had ever seen visitors coming or going from his apartment, despite the building requiring all guests to be signed in after 10 p.m. More concerning were the missing person reports David found when he researched online. Over the past 2 years, 4 people had disappeared after responding to ads for musical collaboration and classical music appreciation groups that police had traced back to Vincent's phone number. That night, David paid closer attention to the music coming from above. The piano playing was definitely live. He could hear the subtle variations and occasional mistakes that would come with real performance. But the humming voices were different. They never varied, never made mistakes, and never seemed to take breaths. Around 3 a.m., the music stopped suddenly, replaced by other sounds. David heard heavy dragging noises, like furniture being moved across the floor. Then came a series of rhythmic thumping sounds, followed by what sounded like digging or scraping. David called the police the next morning, but they said they needed more evidence before they could investigate. The officer suggested David try to record the sounds if they continued. That night, David positioned himself with his phone ready to record. The music began as usual, but this time David noticed something new. Occasionally, the humming would be interrupted by what sounded like muffled screaming or crying, quickly suppressed and returning to the harmonic humming. At 4 a.m., David heard footsteps in the hallway and the sound of Vincent's door opening. Looking through his peephole, David saw Vincent dragging something large and wrapped in a tarp toward the building's service elevator. Vincent's clothes were dirty, and he kept looking around nervously as he struggled with his burden. David followed at a distance and watched Vincent take the elevator down to the basement. 20 minutes later, Vincent returned empty-handed, his clothes now cleaned up. The next morning, David explored the basement. In a storage room that should have been locked, he found disturbed concrete and what looked like recently filled holes in the floor. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of decay and chemical cleaners. David immediately called the police with his recordings and his discoveries. This time they took him seriously. When officers searched Vincent's apartment, they found a horrifying scene. The apartment had been converted into a twisted concert hall. Vincent had soundproofed the walls and set up a grand piano in the center. But around the piano were 4 chairs, each containing the mummified remains of Vincent's victims. The bodies had been preserved and positioned as if they were singing, their mouths held open with wire. Vincent had been playing concerts for his dead audience every night, using a complex system of wires and pulleys to make it appear as if the corpses were moving and breathing. Hidden speakers played recordings of the victims' voices, recordings Vincent had made of them humming and singing before he killed them. In Vincent's bedroom, police found journals detailing his delusion that he was conducting an eternal concert with the perfect audience, one that would never leave, never criticize, and never stop appreciating his music. Vincent was found hiding in the basement, where he had buried 3 additional victims in the concrete floor. When arrested, he kept insisting that his audience needed him. that the concert must go on. During his trial, Vincent showed no remorse. He claimed he had given his victims the gift of eternal music, that they were happier as his permanent audience than they had ever been in life. He was declared legally insane and committed to a psychiatric facility. David moved out of the building the day after Vincent's arrest, but he couldn't escape the memory of those haunting melodies. For months afterward, he would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced he could still hear the ghostly humming of Vincent's dead audience, forever trapped in their midnight concert. The apartment building was eventually converted to offices, but workers reported strange sounds during late-night shifts, classical piano music, and multiple voices humming in harmony, coming from the floors that used to house Vincent's Concert of the Dead. Story 5. The helpful handyman Rachel was thrilled when she bought her first house, a charming but slightly run-down Victorian on Elm Street. As a single woman with limited experience in home repair, she knew she'd need help fixing the various issues that came with an older home. That's when she met Tom, her next-door neighbor. Tom was a friendly man in his 50s who seemed to know everything about home maintenance. He introduced himself the day Rachel moved in, offering to help with anything she might need. "I've been doing handyman work for 20 years, Tom explained with a warm smile. "I know these old houses inside and out. Whatever you need, plumbing, electrical, carpentry, I'm your guy." Rachel was grateful for Tom's offer. He seemed genuine and knowledgeable, and his rates were incredibly reasonable. Over the next few months, Tom helped her with numerous projects around the house. He fixed her leaky faucets, repaired creaky floorboards, and even rewired some of the outdated electrical outlets. But Rachel began to notice some odd things about Tom's work methods. He insisted on doing most of the work alone, claiming he worked better without distractions. He would arrive early in the morning when Rachel was at work and let himself in with the spare key she'd given him. When she returned home, the work would be completed, but Tom would already be gone. More concerning was that Tom seemed to know things about her house that she hadn't mentioned. He would point out problems in areas she'd never shown him, and suggest repairs for issues she didn't even know existed. When she asked how he knew about these problems, Tom would just say he had a good eye for these old houses. One evening, Rachel came home to find Tom just finishing up some work in her basement. She hadn't asked him to do anything in the basement, and was surprised to see him coming up from downstairs. "Just checking your foundation," Tom explained quickly. "I noticed some moisture issues that could become a real problem if not addressed." Rachel thanked him, but felt uneasy. She went down to the basement later and noticed that Tom had moved several boxes and seemed to have been working behind her furnace. The area was cleaner than it had been, but there were fresh tool marks on the wall and what looked like recently installed hardware she didn't recognize. The next week, Rachel's friend Lisa came to visit and stay overnight. In the morning, Lisa mentioned that she'd heard someone walking around the house during the night. "I thought maybe it was you getting a snack," Lisa said, "but when I looked out the guest room window around 2 a.m., I saw a man walking around your backyard with a flashlight." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. She checked all her doors and windows, but everything was locked. However, when she looked more carefully, she noticed that the lock on her basement door looked different, newer, and with fresh scratches around the keyhole. That afternoon, Rachel decided to do some research on Tom. What she found made her blood run cold. Tom's real name was Thomas Mitchell, and he had a criminal record for burglary and stalking. He had served 3 years in prison for breaking into women's homes and stealing personal items, particularly clothing and photographs. More disturbing was a recent news article about a woman in the next town over who had discovered hidden cameras throughout her house. The cameras had been installed by a handyman who had been doing work in her home for months. The handyman's description matched Tom perfectly. Rachel immediately called a locksmith and had all her locks changed. She also decided to search her house thoroughly for anything that seemed out of place. In her bedroom, she found a small hole in the wall behind her dresser that hadn't been there before. The hole was just large enough for a camera lens. In the basement, Rachel discovered what Tom had really been doing. Behind the furnace, he had created a small hidden room, accessible through a panel in the wall. Inside the room, she found a chair, a small table, and dozens of photographs of her taken through the windows of her house. There were pictures of her sleeping, showering, and getting dressed. But the most terrifying discovery was a detailed journal Tom had been keeping. The journal contained her daily schedule, descriptions of her habits, and plans for what he called the next phase. According to his notes, Tom had been planning to eventually move into her house permanently, believing that their relationship had progressed to the point where she would welcome him. Rachel called the police immediately, but when they searched Tom's house, they found evidence that he had been stalking multiple women in the neighborhood. He had keys to at least 6 different houses and had installed surveillance equipment in all of them. Some of the women didn't even know Tom had been in their homes. The most disturbing discovery was Tom's collection. He had been taking personal items from each house, jewelry, clothing, photographs, and had created shrines to each woman in different rooms of his house. He had detailed files on each victim, tracking their routines and relationships. Tom was arrested at his day job at a local hardware store. During questioning, he showed no remorse and seemed genuinely confused about why his behavior was wrong. He claimed he was just being a good neighbor, and that the women should be grateful for his attention and help. The investigation revealed that Tom had been using his handyman business as a cover for stalking for over a decade. He would offer his services to single women, gain their trust, and then use his access to their homes to spy on them and steal personal items. Rachel testified at Tom's trial, along with 8 other women he had stalked. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison for multiple counts of breaking and entering, stalking, and invasion of privacy. Even after Tom's conviction, Rachel couldn't feel safe in her house. She knew that he had been watching her most intimate moments for months, that he had been in her bedroom while she slept. She sold the house and moved to a different state, but she still checks every room for hidden cameras and never gives spare keys to anyone. The Victorian house on Elm Street sat empty for over a year before someone else bought it. The new owners found additional hidden cameras that the police had missed, along with more evidence of Tom's obsession with the house and its occupants. Tom's other victims have all moved away as well, unable to shake the feeling that they're still being watched. Several of them still wake up in the middle of the night, convinced they hear someone walking through their house, checking on his work. Story 6. The Caring Caregiver. Margaret had always been grateful to have such a caring neighbor in Mrs. Patterson. When Margaret's husband died and left her alone in their house at age 78, Mrs. Patterson immediately offered to help with shopping, cooking, and general companionship. Patterson was in her 60s and worked as a home health aide, so she understood the challenges facing elderly people living alone. She would stop by Margaret's house every day, bringing meals, helping with household chores, and just checking in to make sure Margaret was okay. "You remind me so much of my own mother," Mrs. Patterson would say. "I just want to make sure you're taken care of." Margaret appreciated the help, especially since her own children lived far away and could only visit occasionally. Mrs. Patterson seemed genuinely concerned about Margaret's well-being and was always suggesting ways to make her life easier and safer. One of Mrs. Patterson's first suggestions was that Margaret should give her a spare key, just in case of emergencies. She also convinced Margaret to add her name to Margaret's bank account as an authorized user, explaining that this would make it easier to help with bill paying and shopping. Over the next few months, Mrs. Patterson became increasingly involved in Margaret's life. She insisted on managing Margaret's medications, claiming that Margaret was becoming forgetful and might accidentally take too much or too little. She also began screening Margaret's phone calls and visitors, saying she was protecting Margaret from scammers and people who might take advantage of her. Margaret's daughter Susan became concerned when she tried to call her mother, and Mrs. Patterson answered the phone, claiming Margaret was resting and couldn't be disturbed. When Susan insisted on speaking to her mother, Mrs. Patterson reluctantly put Margaret on the line, but stayed in the room listening to the conversation. During that phone call, Margaret seemed different, more confused and tired than usual. She mentioned that Mrs. Patterson was taking such good care of her, and that she didn't need to worry Susan with her problems anymore. When Susan asked about Margaret's medication for diabetes, Margaret couldn't remember what she was taking or when. Susan decided to make an unannounced visit to check on her mother. When she arrived at the house, she found Margaret in bed in the middle of the afternoon, looking frail and disoriented. Mrs. Patterson was in the kitchen, organizing what appeared to be a large number of pill bottles. "Your mother has been having some health issues," Mrs. Patterson explained. "I've been giving her some supplements and natural remedies to help with her energy and memory." Susan examined the pill bottles and found several medications she didn't recognize, along with bottles of over-the-counter supplements with labels that had been removed or covered. When she asked to see Margaret's prescription medications, Mrs. Patterson claimed they were locked away for safety. Over the next few hours, Susan noticed several red flags. Margaret seemed unusually drowsy and complained of nausea and dizziness. The house, which had always been immaculate when Margaret maintained it herself, was now cluttered and dirty. Most concerning was that Margaret seemed afraid to speak when Mrs. Patterson was in the room. Susan insisted on taking her mother to the doctor for a checkup. Mrs. Patterson tried to discourage this, claiming it wasn't necessary and that she had medical training to handle Margaret's needs. That Susan was firm, and reluctantly Mrs. Patterson agreed to let them go alone. At the hospital, blood tests revealed that Margaret had dangerously high levels of insulin in her system, despite not having taken her diabetes medication in weeks. She also showed signs of malnutrition and dehydration, unusual for someone who supposedly had help with meals and daily care. The doctor was concerned enough to admit Margaret for observation and asked about her home care situation. When Susan described Mrs. Patterson's involvement, the doctor became alarmed and suggested they contact Adult Protective Services. The investigation into Mrs. Patterson revealed a horrifying pattern. Over the past 10 years, she had targeted at least 12 elderly people in the area, offering to help them with daily living tasks. In each case, she would gradually isolate her victims from their families and friends, gain control of their finances, and then slowly poison them with insulin overdoses while stealing their money and belongings. Margaret had been receiving nearly lethal doses of insulin for months, administered through the supplements Mrs. Patterson had been giving her. The insulin was causing Margaret's blood sugar to drop dangerously low, making her weak, confused, and dependent on Mrs. Patterson's care. When police searched Mrs. Patterson's house, they found a macabre collection of personal items belonging to her victims: jewelry, photographs, and legal documents. She had been forging wills and power of attorney papers, making herself the beneficiary of her victims' estates. Most disturbing was Mrs. Patterson's detailed notebook documenting each victim's decline. She had been calculating how long she could keep each person alive while gradually increasing their insulin doses, maximizing the time she had to drain their bank accounts before they died. Of the 12 victims investigators identified, only 3 were still alive: Margaret and 2 other women who were found in similar conditions. The other 9 had died over the years, their deaths attributed to natural causes related to diabetes complications or old age. Mrs. Patterson had been present at each death, often as the person who found the body and called for help. Mrs. Patterson showed no remorse when arrested. She claimed she was providing a service, helping elderly people die with dignity, while ensuring their assets didn't go to ungrateful family members. She genuinely believed she was more deserving of her victims' money than their own children. During her trial, it was revealed that Mrs. Patterson had been using her legitimate job as a home health aide to scout for potential victims. She would identify elderly people who lived alone, had substantial assets, and had limited contact with family members. Margaret survived but never fully recovered from months of insulin poisoning. The physical and psychological trauma left her unable to live independently, and she moved to an assisted living facility near Susan's home. She lived in constant fear that someone was trying to poison her and couldn't trust any caregiver. Mrs. Patterson was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Even in prison, she continued to insist that she had been helping her victims and that she deserved their gratitude, not punishment. The case led to new regulations for home health aides and increased oversight of elderly care in the community. But for the families of Mrs. Patterson's victims, no amount of justice could bring back their loved ones or undo the betrayal of trust that had stolen their final years. Susan still struggles with guilt over not recognizing the signs sooner. She had trusted Mrs. Patterson because she seemed so caring and professional, never suspecting that her mother's helpful neighbor was slowly murdering her for money. Story 7. The Night Shift. When Jake took the job as a night security guard for the Riverside Industrial Complex, he thought it would be perfect. The pay was good, the work was easy, and best of all, he would have plenty of time to study for his college courses during the quiet overnight hours. The complex consisted of several warehouse buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence. Jake's job was simple: patrol the grounds every hour, check that all buildings were secure, and monitor the security cameras from his booth at the main gate. On his first night, Jake was given a tour by the day shift supervisor, who warned him about one particular building, Warehouse 7. That building's been empty for about 6 months, the supervisor explained. The company that rented it went out of business, but we've had some issues with vagrants trying to break in, so pay special attention to it during your rounds. Jake nodded and made a mental note to be extra vigilant about Warehouse 7. What the supervisor didn't mention was the building's history, which Jake would have to discover on his own. For the first week, everything went smoothly. Jake would make his hourly rounds, checking doors and windows, and spend the rest of his time studying in the security booth. Warehouse 7 always appeared secure, though Jake noticed that the building seemed colder than the others, and he occasionally heard what sounded like machinery running inside, despite the building being supposedly empty. On his 8th night, Jake was reviewing security camera footage when he noticed movement in one of the cameras monitoring Warehouse 7. A figure appeared to be walking around inside the building, visible through the windows. Jake immediately called the police, and then grabbed his flashlight to investigate. When the police arrived, they found that all the doors and windows were still locked and secure. They searched the building thoroughly, but found no signs of anyone inside. The officer suggested that what Jake had seen might have been shadows from passing cars or reflections on the windows, but Jake knew what he had seen. The figure had been moving deliberately through the building, as if familiar with the layout. The next night, Jake paid closer attention to Warehouse 7's cameras. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the figure appeared again, this time more clearly visible. It was a man in work clothes, carrying what appeared to be tools. He moved through the building methodically, as if performing some kind of maintenance work. Jake could even see him checking gauges and adjusting controls on machinery that wasn't supposed to exist in the empty building. Jake decided to investigate on his own this time. Using his master key, he entered Warehouse 7 during the day and explored the building thoroughly. What he found was disturbing. The building wasn't actually empty. Hidden behind false walls and covered by tarps were complex pieces of industrial equipment, furnaces, conveyor belts, and machines Jake couldn't identify. The equipment was old and appeared to have been abandoned mid-operation, with tools scattered around and half-finished work left on tables. In what had once been an office, Jake found time cards and work schedules dating back 6 months. The schedules showed that workers had been assigned to night shifts, working from midnight to 8 a.m. The last entries were dated just before the company supposedly went out of business. Jake brought this information to his supervisor, who seemed surprised and concerned. The supervisor claimed he had no knowledge of any equipment remaining in the building, and promised to look into it. That night, Jake watched the cameras more intently. At 2:17 a.m., not just one figure appeared in Warehouse 7, but several. Jake could see at least 4 people moving through the building, all wearing work clothes and carrying tools. They moved with purpose, as if following a familiar routine. Jake decided he had to investigate immediately. He entered the building, while the figures were supposedly still inside, but found it completely empty. The machinery was still there, but there were no people. However, Jake noticed that some of the equipment was warm, as if it had been recently running, and there were fresh footprints in the dust on the floor. The next day, Jake researched the company that had previously rented Warehouse 7. What he learned made his blood run cold. Meridian Manufacturing had been operating a night shift in the warehouse, but 6 months earlier, there had been a terrible accident. According to news reports, a gas leak had caused an explosion during the night shift, killing 4 workers instantly. The bodies had been so badly burned that identification was difficult. The company had been investigated for safety violations and ultimately shut down, but the families of the victims claimed the company had covered up the true cause of the accident. Jake realized that the figures he was seeing on the cameras were the ghosts of the workers who had died in the explosion. They were continuing to work their night shift, unaware that they were dead. But the story became even more disturbing when Jake discovered that the accident hadn't been caused by a simple gas leak. According to a lawsuit filed by the victims' families, Meridian Manufacturing had been illegally disposing of toxic chemicals through the warehouse's drainage system. The chemicals had built up in the building's ventilation system, creating a deadly atmosphere that poisoned the workers before the explosion occurred. The company had tried to cover up the illegal dumping by claiming the deaths were caused by an accidental gas leak. The night shift workers had been chosen specifically because they were undocumented immigrants who were less likely to report safety violations or ask questions about the company's operations. Jake shared his discovery with local reporters who investigated the story further. It was revealed that Meridian Manufacturing's executives had known about the toxic conditions in the warehouse but had continued operations to avoid the cost of proper disposal methods. The story made national news, and the executives were eventually prosecuted for criminal negligence and illegal dumping. The warehouse complex was investigated by environmental authorities, who found that the entire building was contaminated with toxic chemicals. But even after the legal proceedings and environmental cleanup, the ghostly workers continued to appear on the security cameras. Jake documented dozens of appearances over the next several months, always at the same time, always performing the same work routine. Other security guards who worked the night shift reported the same sightings. The workers seemed trapped in an endless loop, forever working the shift that had killed them, unable to rest until justice was fully served. Jake eventually left the security job, unable to handle the nightly appearances of the dead workers. The warehouse complex was eventually sold and demolished, but construction workers reported seeing the ghostly figures wandering the site, still carrying their tools, still trying to complete work that could never be finished. The 4 workers were finally properly buried, after their families received a settlement from the lawsuit. Local paranormal investigators claimed that the sightings stopped after the burial, as if the workers' spirits were finally able to find peace once their deaths were acknowledged and their families received justice. But Jake still drives by the empty lot where Warehouse 7 once stood, and sometimes, just after 2 a.m., he swears he can still see the faint outlines of 4 figures walking through the space where the building used to be, forever working the night shift that claimed their lives.